you reading now? Target. 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 Jeff Cummins, Andrew Skilleter, Tony Clark, David McAllister, Spender, Kite, Anne Macero, Walbank Kelly, Bill Donahoe, Knight Burgess, Peter Brooks. On the cover of Target books, Geary, Howard, Little 2, Achilleos, We Love You, from Susan Foreman through to Ace, Alister Pearson, Gave Good Face, all the books they'd make us buy, up to date with Anthony Dry, artists with an attitude. Eager readers in the mood. Don't just sit there, take a look. Movie posters on a book. Target. 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 Target.
Direction point. Direction point.
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network. My name is Jason. This week, we are up to a signal moment in the lives of Doctor Who fans. It is the novelization of the Underwater Menace. Very pleased to feature as a guest this week Nigel Robinson, the author of the novelization, the author of 4 Target novelizations, and also the editor of the Target book range in the 1980s. I want to thank Dale Smith for helping to arrange the interview. My apologies to Cy Hart, who had volunteered for this episode way back when. We will, of course, feature Cy's voice on a later episode, as Cy has been on so many episodes of Doctor Who literature in the past. When you think about Underwater Menace, I first encountered it as an nth generation copy on VHS tape mailed to me by a Doctor Who fan in the States in the mid-1990s. For those of you of a certain age, those nth generation copies were a challenge to watch. Most of the dialogue was inaudible. Most of the pictures were nearly impossible to discern, with the interference caused by so many generations of copying from tape to tape to tape, as if VHS was even the most crystal clear medium with which to watch television in the first place. Watching Underwater Menace Part 3 as an nth generation copy is even a more trippy experience than watching Underwater Menace on Blu-ray, as we can now do in this year 2024. The dance of the fish people, and of course the infamous cliffhanger chant, "Nothing in the world can stop me now," are all much, much better on fuzzy, blurry, hard to hear nth generation VHS copies. That calling card, "Nothing in the world can stop me now," marks you as a Doctor Who fan. Listener and guest of the show, Michael Storm, did send me a link to a very early RTD TV production, Dark Season, where one episode begins with the cold open of the bad guy peering into the camera and uttering those famous words. Hopefully by now most of you have seen the Underwater Menace animation. Although I was not able to feature Cy Hart's voice this week, I will put a link in the show notes. Cy and Fraser Gregory and myself all got together on the Trap One podcast earlier in 2024 to discuss the Underwater Menace color animation. In a moment, we'll feature Nigel Robinson talking to us for about an hour about his Doctor Who fandom, his role in the books, his 4 novelizations, his 2 new adventures, his work for Big Finish Audios, and so much, much, much more. Follow that is my review of Underwater Menace, the TV serial, and the novelization. There's a lot of fun to be had over the next 80 minutes of this Doctor Who literature episode. You can find all past episodes on Spotify as well as on YouTube. On Spotify, we're Doctor Who Literature. On YouTube, we're at Doctor Who Novels, Dr. Who Novels. And you can always catch me on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature @gmail.com. We also want to thank Doctor Who Literature co-producer and co-host Jim Sangster for his opening number, featuring tribute to all the many Target book cover artists. This is the first novelization painted by Alister Pearson, whose name will be heard a lot more as we cover the rest of the Doctor Who novelizations between 1988, when Underwater Menace came out in paperback, and the conclusion of the line several years later. In the meantime, let's get to it.
A Whovian and a Nuvian walk into a TARDIS.
And explore every episode of the classic Doctor Who series.
Join me, podcaster John S. Drew.
And me, writer-editor Jim Beard, as we take apart each story starting from the very beginning in 1963.
And join us on our Facebook page and Twitter, where we continue the discussion with you with historical artifacts from British papers of the time. The Doctor's Beard podcast, released every Saturday around tea time on your favorite podcasting app.
And we'll see you in time and space. You're listening to Doctor Who Literature. Keep turning the pages.
Even supposing you succeeded, you know what will happen, don't you? You tell me, Doctor. Well, the water will be converted into superheated steam, the pressure will grow, and crack the crust of the Earth. Destroy all life, maybe even blow the planet apart.
Yes, and I shall have redeemed my promise to lift Atlantis from the sea. Lift it to the sky. It will be magnificent.
Yes. Bang! 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 Bang!
Like so.
Yes. Just one small question. Why do you want to blow up the world?
Why? You, a scientist, ask me why? The achievement, my dear doctor. The destruction of the world. The scientist's dream of supreme power.
All right, I want to give a big thank you to Nigel Robinson for joining me on Doctor Who Literature this morning. Nigel, how are you?
I'm very well indeed. How are you?
We had an opportunity to speak about 2 years ago about your Unearthly Child book for Vorp, the fanzine, and that issue recently came out. I'm hoping to feature the audio from that interview on a forthcoming episode. It was you and Michael Stevens, the audio range editor. Today, the book of the week, we are up to Underwater Menace, which was one of the 4 novelizations that you wrote. I have my copy as well. And I also brought with me several other of your books that I have. I have more books of you in my house than I do of Charles Dickens. I have the quiz books and your new adventures, among many others. And, of course, all the other novelizations. So I want to start with Unearthly Child. I want to start with Underwater Menace, I should say, and then work backwards to your other many Doctor Who contributions. How did you come to novelize Underwater Menace?
I was working as editor at WHL and Target, and then I left, I resigned to go freelance. So I decided I'd like to commission myself to do some novelizations. And Underwater Menace was one of them, because nobody else wanted to do it, touch it with a barge pole. It had such a bad reputation. Terrence didn't want to do it, Ian Martin didn't want to do it. So I thought, what the hey, I'll do it.
What was the process like for novelizing a missing story? I don't know if you had the chance to see the surviving episode 3 at that point, or if you only were working from draft scripts.
All the BBC were very bad at providing scripts of the 4 stories I novelized. So in the end, I transcribed all 4 stories from existing audios.
Oh my goodness.
And then I looked at the existing videos as well, which I think for Underwater Menace at that time was only 1 episode.
And that was the infamous episode 3, Nothing in the World Can Stop Me Now cliffhanger.
That's the one, yeah.
Which you rather cleverly put as a chapter title in here.
Yeah, I thought I had to do that. I felt honor bound to do that.
The ending of Underwater Menace fascinates me because for the longest time, the only access that I had to the story would have been your novelization, which ends with this knockdown, drag-out fight between Professor Zaroff and I think Lolum, the High Priest of the Atlantean civilization. When I finally got to the loose cannon reconstruction of Episode 4 several years ago, I was very excited to see how this fight happened on screen. Turns out there is no fight on screen. Zaroff just drowns trying to reach through bars to flip a switch, and he can't quite do it, and spends 10 minutes drowning very unnecessarily. That, I can imagine, would not have been very fun to novelize. How did you come on the idea of creating this fight?
Oh, because I thought the way it ended on the screen wasn't great fun. I was also aware that Lolam, who is the High Priest in Atlantis, was quite a major character in the first couple of episodes, and then just vanished. No one mentioned him again. I think someone said in the final few minutes, Lolam must have died. So I thought, we've got to do something with Lolam. And Lolam was essentially a religious fanatic. Zaroff was essentially a scientific fanatic. And they hated each other's guts. So the most appropriate thing would be to have religion and science fighting each other right at the very, very end. So that's why I brought Lolam in to fight Zaroff to the death.
It works so well in the book that I literally can't imagine the TV production without it. But since this book came out, we now have access to Episode 2, which was recovered, I think, in 2011, as well as the animations, which were released last year. Have you had a chance to catch up with the newest versions of Underwater Menace, and have they changed your perspective on this formerly unloved story?
I like the story. Don't get me wrong, I like the story. I thought it was quite good that we got Episode 2 is the one which was returned quite recently, wasn't it? Episode 2?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's very good. I must admit, I wasn't a great fan of the new animation for Underwater Menace. I thought it was a bit too cartoony. But I think it's a decent enough story. It's an average Doctor Who. Nice bit of fun, bit of schlock, but great fun.
Nothing in the world can stop me now!
You novelized a total of 4 Doctor Who books for Target. How did you come to the range as editor to begin with?
That's a long story. I went to university and I graduated, and back then there were no jobs. So I had a friend who was a fellow fan of The Lord of the Rings. So we would go to the pub every lunchtime and test each other's knowledge on Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and the rest of the Tolkien stuff. Eventually we had enough questions that we put it into a manuscript, and myself and my friend Linda, we sent it to W.H. Allen, who published it. And it just so happened that W.H. Allen published Target books as well. And my friend Linda was not a fan of Doctor Who at all. So I said, hey, I like Doctor Who. Let me do a Doctor Who quiz book. And the fools said yes. So that's how I did the first Doctor Who quiz book. The commission fee for a crossword book then the second Doctor Who quiz book, by which time I was working freelance for W.H. Allen as a proofreader and a copy editor, largely on the Doctor Who books. So I did that for about 2 years. And Christine Donaher, who was the editor of the Doctor Who range, was, how should we say, not the kind of Doctor Who. In fact, she hated it. So I was basically brought in to take over that part of the range from her. So Christine gave me the Doctor Who books, and from then on, I worked on the rest of the Target books as well. It all came from me writing Tolkien questions in a pub when I was unemployed.
With Lord of the Rings, the movies, and then the 3 Hobbit movies, and now the Amazon TV series, is there a market for a second Tolkien quiz book?
There are quite a few Tolkien quiz books out, actually. Myself and my friend Linda, we approached someone a few years ago to republish our Tolkien quiz book, but the market is swamped with Tolkien quiz books at the moment. There are at least 2 or 3 out on the market. So no.
I was never able to find the first Doctor Who quiz book here in the States. I suppose I should track it down on eBay. I do have the second and third books with me. looking at these and knowing that you were writing this before the internet, how did you manage to organize all the questions and all the answers for 3 of these books, writing in the early to mid 1980s, before we had all the reference materials we have now?
Well, bear in mind, first of all, that I bought the Target books since they were first republished in what was 1976, I think. So I had a whole pile of Target books. So a lot of the research was from the Target books. However, we had to get the approval of the BBC to do the books. And so we approached John Nathan Turner. And John Nathan Turner was very keen on the idea. So all the stories which had not then been novelized by Target, he invited me to the BBC, to the Doctor Who offices. In fact, I was in Eric Saywood's office for about a week when Eric wasn't working. And Eric had all the scripts there, so all the existing scripts. So I just went through all the old scripts which had not been novelized by Target. And I also read Castrovalva before it even came out.
Ooh.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorite of the novelizations. That has to have been a fun experience.
Yeah. And the fun thing was about working in Eric Saywood's office was on his bulletin board, there was a cutting from a Radio Times from the 1960s of a picture of the Cybermen. And there was a little post-it, or whatever post-it was in that day, which said, "Eric, this may be of interest to you." Which is why when Earthshock came out about a year later, I was not surprised.
Ah, so you saw the genesis of Earthshock on Eric Saywood's office wall.
Yes, yes.
Destroy them at once!
Another Cyberman story as well, which has got nothing to do with Target. It was that I was working as an office temp at Kendall Avenue, which is the BBC TV's head of transport. So I actually organised all the transport for Attack of the Cybermen. Not a lot of people know that.
I was not aware of that. What was the process for that like? I imagine it's a lot of lorries and vans and such.
I mean, it was just they came to the office and said, "We need to get this from here to there," and we decided which transportation was best for them, and we booked it and ordered it.
Did you book yourself along for the trip so you could see some of the location footage or location shooting?
No, I didn't. It was all very professional.
As someone who's been an office worker myself for the past, quarter century, I should say, what was the day-to-day like working as the Target range editor? How did you structure your day? What was your office like? How much contact did you have with JNT and the TV production office?
We had not an awful lot of contact. I mean, I saw JNT at least twice a year for long, boozy lunches. And obviously, every manuscript which came in had to be okayed by John, which he okayed everything. And we only had exclusive rights to do the novelizations. So any other Doctor Who thing, like the knitting book or the cookbook, we had to negotiate those separately. And even the Peter Haining books, we had to negotiate those separately.
I have those in the other room. That's a Celebration, and I believe the early years. Or maybe that was Jeremy Bentham.
That was Jeremy, yeah.
So how many books would you have going at a time between the monthly novelizations and all the nonfiction books coming out in the mid-'80s?
Well, one novelization every single month, and probably about 3 nonfiction books a year.
So you must have been very busy. How much support staff did you have in terms of editing or what have you?
None.
None.
No, it's all down to me.
My goodness. And you also wrote 4 novelizations total. We also have The Censorites, we have The Time Meddler, and Edge of Destruction. How many of those came when you were on staff? How many came afterwards when you were freelance?
No, I commissioned myself to do all 4 when I was still staff. But they were written when I was no longer working for WHR. So I commissioned myself and then left.
I imagine the writing process for those was similar to Underwater Menace, and that you might not have had surviving video or surviving scripts.
That's absolutely right, yes.
And these were all Hartnell and Troughton stories, so you're limiting yourself to monochrome and stories that aren't fully extant. Having read all 4 of these in order, because I go in publication order on this show, I see that the Censorites is the one that is the most faithful to the TV story. And
Yes.
by Edge of Destruction, you are adding a lot of material, because the TV episode by itself wouldn't really fill out to 140 pages.
That's right, yeah.
In terms of questions about your writing process, I've got a bunch of questions, but let me start off with who were your influences in terms of prose style? Who were the writers that you loved growing up, and what were you consciously bringing to bear in your own books?
I don't think I was consciously bringing to bear anything, but one of my favourite authors was Terrance Dicks. I mean, like so many people, I grew up learning to read with Terrance Dicks. So he's my hero. And he's got more people to read than anyone else. Forget your J.K. Rowling's. He's got so many more people to read and to write.
I can believe that. I discovered Terrance when I was 11 or 12 years old, and for the next several years, he was almost the bulk of my discretionary reading. And even today, I still find myself reading him almost every week for this podcast. And even though his prose style has been accused of being simple, I find it's very difficult to write as clearly and as precisely as he does, using as few words as he does. What was it like editing him? Did you ever have any conversations with him about his prose style?
Not really, because before I was working with WH, he was doing about 12 novels a year,
Right.
one every month. So they were a lot more simple. By the time when I got there, he was probably doing about 3 a year. So we had much more time to develop characters and expand the story and the plot. But I take exception to the suggestion that being simple might be bad. It's not. Being simple is good. But having said that, some of Terrance's stuff when he was doing 12 a year aren't exactly wonderful.
He was doing books that were barely 100 pages in the late 70s, and by the mid-80s, he's back to 140 pages.
That's right, yes.
What I especially love about Terrance's style is the way that he can describe a character in 5 words or 10 words and say more about that person in 5 or 10 words than other writers can do in several paragraphs. It's an incredible skill.
How did he describe Peter Davison's Doctor, the one with the open, honest face?
I think it was the pleasant open face, if memory serves me right.
Yeah.
And with Tom Baker, it was the vaguely bohemian clothing.
Mm-hmm.
And there were several others for each Doctor.
And, of course, the wheezing and groaning for the TARDIS.
Yes, the wheezing. I think that has finally been canonized in the TV series now, the wheezing, groaning sound.
Telly, yeah, it made the telly.
Malcolm Hulke had been a prolific target writer in the 70s. I believe he would have passed away before you came to work for W.H. Allen. But I imagine that you worked quite a bit with Ian Marter, who had 8 or 9 books published while you were there.
Yeah, that's one Mac Hulke, so.
The Cave Monsters.
Yes, I worked a lot with Ian Marter, who was absolutely wonderful. He approached me, first of all, to write Doctor Who novelizations. He approached me in the corridor of W.H. Allen one day, and he was great. He was a great person to work with, a fantastic writer. And it's such a shame that he died when he did.
He passed away, I believe, in October 1986. So the books that he came out with in 1987, which I believe are Reign of Terror and The Rescue, would have come out posthumously.
That's right, yeah. The Rescue certainly did, yes.
Did you have to do any editing work on those last 2 books if he had passed away before they were put to bed, so to speak?
Nothing on the Reign of Terror, apart from normal editing work. I did a bit more work on The Rescue because it hadn't actually been delivered to me when he died. And the manuscript was given to me by his widow. Ooh. So I worked a little bit more on it, but not to a great amount. But I wrote a few paragraphs for that, but that was all.
What was Ian Marter like as a person? I never had the opportunity to meet him.
Absolutely brilliant. I met him so often at conventions as well, and he was fantastic company at conventions, and he gave fans all the time they wanted with him. And he had a great respect for the fans and for Doctor Who as a show.
Your last novelization in the target range is Edge of Destruction, which is one of the ones that fascinates me, because the TV story obviously is a bottle story. It's done on 1 or 2 sets. It only has the 4 cast members. And if you're watching it in movie format, it's over in 45 minutes.
I wish I could understand you, Doctor. One moment you're abusing us, and the next you're playing the perfect butler.
A little nightcap to help us relax and sleep.
If it is night, we have no way of telling now.
Your challenge is to expand this out to a 140-page manuscript. How did you approach Edge of Destruction? How did you decide what to add? How did you decide what to include verbatim?
I just wanted to explore more of the TARDIS, such as the great engine rooms and the Doctor's laboratory, and bring a lot of menace to it, brooding menace to it. There's one scene in which Barbara is attacked in the Doctor's, I think it's the library, or is it the laboratory? I'm not quite sure which. But I took that from the Poltergeist episode in The Haunting, the movie The Haunting. Wow. The original Haunting, not the awful remake. The Robert Wise version of about 1962, which is the scariest movie I've ever seen in my life.
I've seen a lot of Robert Wise, and I saw the original Poltergeist in 1982 far more times than it's appropriate for an adolescent boy. I have not seen The Haunting. I'll have to add that one to my list.
You must see The Haunting. It stars Claire Bloom as well. He went on to do Doctor Who as well.
Yes, she was the mystery character in The End of Time, if memory serves me.
That's right, yes.
One of the details in Edge of Destruction, which I quite love, is the TARDIS background hum when the ship is having its troubles becomes sort of like a breathing noise. How did you come up with that? That's really creepy.
I came up with because TARDIS is a living creature. It's a living creature, and it was trying to communicate to them. The breathing was like Barbara, Barbara, trying to attract Barbara's attention away from the danger which was waiting there. So the TARDIS is a living, thinking machine.
By the time you're writing Edge of Destruction, some of the stories had come out on commercial video. Of course, we're still several years away from the DVD line. So for the last of the novelizations, did you have access to video, or again, were you transcribing from the audio at that point?
I was still transcribing from the audio because the 4 I had done had not then been released on video, on VHS.
One of the advantages I had in the States was by 1985, we were starting to get the Hartnell package on PBS long before they were re-aired on the BBC. So I would have seen Time Meddler and I would have seen Edge of Destruction before I read the books. That's one of the advantages that I would have had in the States. But coming back to you, when did you discover Doctor Who? What are the earliest stories that you can remember watching?
I can tell you, it's March 1965, I think. Episode 5 of The Web Planet.
Wow.
That was the very first Doctor Who episode I ever saw live.
Oh, it's absolutely beautiful.
It must be a temple of light. The ancient song spinners of our race sang of their beauty, but I thought they could never be found again.
There are others?
So the legends say, sown into the craters and plateaus of Vortis, being slowly unwoven by the silence of time, and their entrances long forgotten by our species. But our gods have not forgotten us, Abana. This was indeed deliverance.
Do you remember the impression that it made on you?
It scares me senseless.
Huh.
But I have to watch it next week. I don't know if you recall the Web Planet, but at the end of episode 5, the Doctor and Vicky are attacked by the Animus and they're covered in web.
Yes.
Credits. That's the scariest moment. That's my introduction to Doctor Who.
I imagine you had several sleepless nights the following week until the next Saturday when the story resolves.
That's right, yeah.
So you would have seen the Time Meddler very early on, and that, I imagine, would have been in your mind when you were novelizing it.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Did you continue to watch every week at that point, or did you drift away from the show, as many folks do as they get a little bit older?
I stayed with it since I saw the Doctor and Vicky getting webbed in the Web Planet.
You would have seen a lot of stories then that later went missing. So do you have any specific memories of the Season 3 stories that we have now lost and cannot watch, like the Mythmakers or the Massacre, or especially the Daleks Master Plan?
I remember the Daleks Master Plan very, very well indeed. By that time in the 60s, the UK was Dalek mad. They were in comics, they were in the toy shops, they were about to go on the big screen as well. So I remember that very well indeed. I do remember certain bits of the Massacre as well, especially William Hartnell's final speech at the end, and the Toymaker as well, the Celestial Toymaker, which everyone now is going down on, but at the time as a kid, it was absolutely enchanting and enthralling.
I have to ask, in terms of the animation, did you have a chance to see the recent Celestial Toymaker animation, which is very, very reimagined and not just a mere summary of the camera scripts, because they're not able to do more now with four-dimensional space and non-humanoid characters.
I'm a purist, basically. I'd like to see it as I saw it, but I see what they're doing with that for a new audience, and in that case, they've done a fine job. It's not quite my Toymaker, but it's a fine job for a certain demographic.
What would it have been like for you watching The 10th Planet in 1966? Were people aware that William Hartnell was leaving the show? Were you expecting the regeneration? And how did you transition into Patrick Troughton the following week with Power of the Daleks?
I'm sure I can't. I mean, I certainly remembered Hartnell regenerating because I would not have missed it. But I can't recall whether I must have known that he was going to change. It would have been in the press. The following week, I did not like Patrick Troughton for about 20 minutes. And then when the end of the first episode of Power of the Daleks, when he says to Ben and Polly, I'd like to introduce you to the Daleks, then it hit me. I got him.
Oh, wow. This is probably a very unfair question, but who is your Doctor, the one that is your absolute favorite after all this time?
I don't have a favorite Doctor. That changes a lot. My Doctor is William Hartnell, because your first Doctor is always your Doctor.
That would be the same for me and Peter Davison, certainly. What about companions? Especially by season 3, companions were coming and going with alarming speed. Who would be your favorite companions?
Hartnell, Vicky, Troughton, Jamie and Zoe, Pertwee, Joe, Baker, I'm not going to say Sarah Jane, probably Romana too. And Peter Davison, I might actually say Adric. And then Colin, Nell, and Sylvester Ace.
I suppose you've had a chance to watch Bonnie Langford's return to the series with RTD the last year.
Yeah, isn't she wonderful?
She is absolutely phenomenal.
I mean, I've always adored Bonnie Langford. I know nobody who's worked with her who has a bad word to say about her. I don't think she was great her first time round because no one knew how to direct her, and she thought she was in a stage show. But this time round, they've calmed her down. She's fantastic. So good on Bonnie.
Absolutely. I've never had a chance to see her on stage, but I know she has a new Doctor Who novel out where she references almost all the characters that she has played over the years.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Which is a very long list of characters, to be sure. So you, again, primarily were writing for Hartnell and Troughton in the novelizations. And at this point, as many of the original writers were being brought back to write their books, so William Ems comes back after 20 years, Paul Erickson comes back after 20 years. Were you responsible for commissioning the returning writers?
Yes.
What was it like working with them? Because I imagine many of them would not have been involved with Doctor Who for a long time and might not have known the novelization format or remember their stories very well.
Most of them had no idea there were Doctor Who novels out.
Wow.
They had no idea at all. Doctor Who for them was just a job. But then they got hearing that they were selling quite well in the States and there was money in it. So rather than let someone else write the book and they take just half the profits, they thought, we'll write the book and take all the profits. But to be fair, I mean, when they were novelizing their own scripts, they were very, very good because no one knows that story as much as they do or did.
Especially a book like The Ark, where Paul Erickson is able to add a lot of scenes, doing more world building and adding more characters.
Right, yeah.
Were there any stories that you would have wanted to novelize which you didn't get a chance to do, even, for example, with later Doctors like Pertwee and McCoy?
Not particularly, because Troughton and Hartnell were really my Doctors. I would have loved to have been able to have done The Celestial Toymaker, but Jerry Davis did that.
And Alison Benjamin, who I believe was an American TV writer at around the same time.
Right, yeah.
Do you recall for that particular book who did the bulk of the writing? Did they split equally? Did one of them write more than the other?
It was presented to me as being co-written by both of them, and to be honest, I don't really believe that. I think Alison did it all herself.
I covered that book for this podcast a few months ago. That was my impression as well, because having read all of Jerry Davis's earlier books, he had a very rich prose style and a deep vocabulary. And Celestial Toymaker read as a little more simple. Not simple as a bad thing, but it didn't read with the same level of prose style that I was used to from him.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that Alison did most of it, if not all of it.
So by 1991, as the Targets are winding down, Target is acquired by Virgin Publishing, and the new adventures start coming out. I was 18 years old when I discovered those, and those hit my fandom at an absolute great time. So I can tell you exactly where and when I bought the first of your new adventures, Time War Apocalypse.
Yeah.
How did you get into the new adventures line?
Well, when Peter Darvill Evans, who was my successor at WH Allen, Virgin, Target, whatever you like to call it, when he got the license to do them, he wanted some authors he could rely on. So he approached John Peel, who'd done lots of sci-fi work, approached Terence, obviously, approached me because I'd done the stuff and I was the editor as well, and then he picked up Paul Cornell. So he wanted 4 reliable authors to start the range, who he knew would deliver on time.
Was this your first original novel?
Yes, it was.
One of the things I loved about this when I first read it in 1991 is that you open with an epigraph from Logopolis, which is my all-time stone-cold favorite story and novelization. What were your influences when writing this book?
I was working for Bantam Books at the time, and there was a book we were publishing called, I think it's called The God Engine, or something like that, The God Machine, The God Engine. And it was about trying to create an omnipotent being or creature, which is what I was trying to do with the Grand Matriarch. So it's based on that. But you mentioned the Logopolis thing. I don't know who came up with the idea of using that quote from Logopolis, but it wasn't me.
Huh.
It might have been Peter Darvill Evans, but it certainly wasn't me.
A couple of years later, you come back and you write a second new adventure, which is Birthright, which is the first of the Dr. Light books. How did you come to this one, and how involved were you in the plotting? Were you presented with the idea that the Doctor cannot be in this book, or did you have the idea on your own?
Peter Darvill Evans sent out a general letter asking for more pictures. So I came up with this Doctor Who story set in sort of Jack the Ripper country. And Peter got back to me and said, it's great, I really like it, but take the Doctor out. And I just thought it was totally bonkers. Absolutely bonkers. I think it was an inspired decision, though, because I think it works better with the Doctor not being there. But the Doctor really is there all the time because the influence is felt, but he's not there in person. And I love doing it because I love Victorian London. The one thing I would have done if I had the choice was not included Ace. just do it as a Benny book with the Doctor influencing Benny. Not because I didn't like Ace, but I just thought I felt happier writing for Benny in Victorian London.
I will say, as a reader, Benny comes out stupendously in this book.
Thank you.
Another question that I've been sitting on and for more than 30 years now, if you're allowed to answer, who is Moldwich supposed to be? I've seen a lot of online theories.
Who do you think he is?
The online theory that we came up with on Records Doctor Who was he was the Doctor's brother, which doesn't quite sound right to me, but it's the theory that I've gone with because I can't think of any better ideas.
There are some clues all the way through the book. His description of tea, which is a noxious infusion of herbs, or something along those lines. Someone said that in a Doctor Who story once.
Good, I quite missed that brown liquid they drink here.
Ale?
No, tea.
What be tea?
Oh, a noxious infusion of oriental leaves containing a high percentage of toxic acid.
Sounds an evil brew, don't it?
True. Personally, I rather like it.
Moldwich saw the last lion on Earth being shot to death. Sylvester McCoy remembers seeing that as well. So he's a doctor.
Ah, future Doctor.
Future Doctor, and he is not the Merlin Doctor, which something is not the Merlin Doctor. Far in the future, yeah.
Excellent, thank you so much. So you have other books that I have not read, although I have several of your books in my house. I do not have your novelizations, for example, of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles or Free Willy. How did you come to those other books?
Basically just hawking my wares around various publishers. I've got a reputation within publishing, especially from WHL and Bantam Books, Transworld, with whom I work. So I just offered my services to people, and they knew that I could deliver more or less to deadlines. So that's how they all happened. I also novelized some Baywatch books as well.
I will have to my shame as a teenage boy in the late 80s, admit that I never watched Baywatch.
Neither did I until they asked me to novelize them.
What was that process like? Did you have to watch the episodes when you were sitting there cringing?
I cringed watching the episodes, yes.
For Indiana Jones, did you have a chance to speak with George Lucas or even Matthew Jacobs, who wrote some of those episodes and later wrote for Doctor Who?
Not at all, no. I was just handed the scripts, told to novelize them, do my own research, do my own historical research, because they were all meant to be educational as well as be exciting. So I did lots of research on I think the First World War for those. I didn't do the novelization of Free Willy. I did tie-ins with Free Willy. I think Free Willy, The World of Killer Whales. They were sort of non-fiction books about whales. So I didn't do the novelization.
And you have also done some Big Finish adaptations. The ones that I've heard were First Doctor stories, either unproduced scripts or missing stories. What was it like writing with Big Finish and coming back to revisit the First Doctor?
Absolutely fantastic. I think I was regarded at the time anyway as the go-to writer for Hartnell. But they gave me Farewell Great Macedon, which is just the most amazing script ever. I had such a blast doing that. And Carol Ann Ford and William Russell and John Dorney, who played Alexander the Great, were just absolutely fantastic in their roles. That's one of the things I'm proudest of.
I have listened to that one, and that is definitely a favorite of mine. The William Hartnell walking on burning coal scene is still, it's one of those things that I can see, even though it was only on audio.
Mm-hmm.
How much historical research did you do for that one with the Alexander the Great story?
I did, funnily enough, not as much as you might think, because I am very, very familiar with the story of Alexander the Great anyway. So there was very little research I had to do because I knew most of it anyway. A couple of things I did research. The Ishtar Gate in Babylon. I visited the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, which has got a replica of that. So I did that research there. But I knew most of the Alexander story anyway. It's a fascinating story.
And you and I have talked before about the Unearthly Child novelization, which for rights reasons has not been released. And I know there's not too much we can say about it. But just in brief, how did you come to be commissioned for that?
It was commissioned by Michael for the 50th anniversary, and obviously the audiobook to put out, the obvious thing was the first story. But Michael thought that Terence's version of Unearthly Child, which he wrote in about 2 weeks, was a bit too, going back to what we said, a bit too simple. So he wanted me to flesh out the story a lot more, which I did. I had a great time doing it. It's one of the proudest things I've ever done in my life, and I'm really pissed off that it's not available. Even I haven't heard it being read.
I guess you weren't there when William Russell came in to do the audiobook?
I wasn't actually there when William Russell was recording it at all. So I don't know how it sounds.
Let me get this straight. A thing that looks like a police box standing in a junkyard, it can move anywhere in time and space?
I may have asked you this for the other recording 2 years ago. How long would that manuscript have been? Terence is about 120, 130 pages, which arguably is not enough room.
Yeah. My Unearthly Child will probably go to about 144 pages.
One day, hopefully, we will be able to read that.
No. I've got it at home. I've made my own little PDF version, target version of it, so I read that occasionally.
And you are the only person who has access to that, I guess.
That's right, yeah.
Oh, very tantalizing. So I've asked you a lot of questions. Anything else that we haven't talked about, either your Doctor Who work or about any of your many other books over the years?
No, I mean, I've done an awful lot of stuff. I've done romantic novels for girls. I've done science fiction for boys. I've done a series of horror books for kids as well. So this, that, and everything, really.
Of all the books that you've authored now over the last 40-odd years, do you have a particular favorite?
Probably Unearthly Child. I really think so, yeah. And I'm very proud of Farewell Great Macedon as well. And of my novelizations, I've got a great self-admiration for The Time Meddler, which was one of my favorite stories when I was a kid.
So that's it! You're a time meddler. No wonder you wanted to get rid of me. And what are you trying to get up to this time,
I'm sure you'll approve, Doctor.
Are you quite mad? You know as well as I do the golden rule about space and time traveling. Never, never interfere with the course of history.
And who says so? Doctor, it's more fun my way. I can make things happen ahead of their time.
Is that so?
Yes, indeed. For instance, do you really believe the ancient Britons could have built Stonehenge without the aid of my anti-gravitational lift?
And what's the mischief are you up to now?
Mischief? No. A master plan to end all master plans.
Oh, is that so?
The whole course of history changed in one single swoop.
By wiping out the Viking fleet?
Exactly, Doctor, exactly.
You know, I reread Time Meddler recently for this show, and one of the things I picked up on now that I hadn't picked up on 30 years ago is you give a lot more detail to what happens to the monk after the end of the story. So you give him a whole separate journey lasting 2 or 3 months as he keeps trying and failing to prevent the Battle of Hastings.
That's right, yeah.
What was your thought process like for adding that bit in? Because I really enjoyed that this time around.
Well, I just thought that the monk had this great wish to stop William the Conqueror becoming king. So he wouldn't just give up when the Doctor stranded him there. He'd go down to London trying to stop the coronation on Christmas Day. And of course he didn't.
I may have asked you a version of this question earlier in our chat. Are there any other Doctor Who stories that you would happily novelize now, given a chance, or renovelize?
Renovelize? As I say, I would love to have done The Celestial Toymaker. No, I don't think so. Perhaps The Ark, actually, because the Ark made a great impression on me when I was a kid as well. Yeah, The Ark. And the War Games.
Ah, yes. The War Games is one of the most frequent complaints that I see about the War Games is that, given that it's a 10-episode long TV serial, the book is just too darn short. But at the time, the book was the maximum allowable target length, 144 pages. And I thought that Malcolm Hulke did a very good job of editing out some of the repetitive material and writing some new material for the book, which is a little bit punchier. If you had a chance to do War Games, how long do you think it would be, and what sort of embellishments do you think you might make?
I go a lot more into the characters' motivations, and especially what happened to them after they were sent back to their various times. I spend a lot more on Jamie and Zoe and the sheer anguish of having to leave the Doctor. I probably take the War Games up to about 168 pages.
That would certainly give it a lot more room to breathe. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
If only we could read that. And this is probably a risky question, but watching the new series, are there any particular new series stories that you've seen? I want to write that.
Not for quite a while, actually, no.
Any of the new series historicals or pseudo-historicals that especially grabbed your attention?
I loved all the stuff, all the pseudo-historicals that Chris Chibnall did. And no matter what one says about him, he did make an effort to bring back to Doctor Who some of the educational remit. I mean, for instance, the Mary Seacole in the Sontaran.
Yes.
So I'd never even heard of her, so I learned about her. And I'm sure loads of people had never heard of Rosa Parks, so they learned about her via Doctor Who. So it's great science fiction, but educational at the same time. So good for him for doing that.
And for me as well, Demons of the Punjab. I knew a little bit about Partition, but that story just broke me in half. That's a really effective script, I thought.
Yeah, yeah. I think they all were. It's such a shame that they have to shove in a little bit of sci-fi in these historicals as well. I'd love to see a pure historical Doctor Who again. That would be fun and brave.
Going back to the Hartnell and early Troughton era, what would have been your favorite historical?
With hindsight, The Massacre, but probably The Mythmakers, which I suppose isn't really historical because it's a myth. But I was brought up with the Greek myths and Trojan myths as well, so I really enjoyed that. But looking back now, definitely The Massacre. And I do remember, as I said before, I remember the final episode of The Massacre. And I also remember the ending of episode 3 of The Massacre, where there's a body lying in the French gutter and you don't know whether it's a doctor or not. I remember seeing that and being really worried for a week. Thought Doctor Who has died.
So you had to carry that cliffhanger Saturday to Saturday, wondering if that was really the Doctor.
Yeah. That's right, yeah.
I expect that you were involved with the commissioning of both the Mythmaker and the Massacre novelizations?
I wasn't involved with the commission of the Mythmakers because I had inherited that from Christine Donahoe. She commissioned it, but she'd left by the time that Donald Cotton delivered, so I edited it. But I commissioned the Massacre, yeah.
So let me ask you quickly about both of those, if you have another minute. The Mythmakers is... Donald Cotton had this really whimsical prose style. Each of his 3 books, he would narrate through a historical, or in the case of Homer, a mythological figure. So he takes a lot of liberties with the TV scripts and adding humor and writing in the first person. What was it like working with him and editing those the Mythmakers? Because with the end of the Mythmakers, he doesn't seem to have had the script for part 4. So when he gets to that part of the book, he goes off on his own and has very little resemblance to what aired on television. What would that editing process have been like?
It was Donald's story. If I thought it worked well, I'd let it go. I preferred it to be very, very strict to what was transmitted, but it's his story. So if he wants to tweak it a little bit, that's great. And I think in the Mythmakers, certainly, he wrote one of the best Doctor Who novelizations ever.
It is very, very, very clever, very, very witty. A lot of good wordplay on there.
So's the Gunfighters as well. The Romans, not so much, I must admit, because that wasn't his script. It was Dennis Spooner's script. But the Mythmakers and the Gunfighters, great Doctor Who novelizations. He was a lovely man as well.
So many people I didn't get a chance to meet, unless they came to the States for conventions. I just never had the opportunity. I wish I'd met a lot of these writers. So for The Massacre, John Lucarotti is commissioned for the novelization, but he did not write what aired on television, and he ends up submitting a very different story. What was that process like? Was there ever a chance of getting Donald Tosh to write his version of The Massacre, or was John Lucarotti the only choice? And how did he come to his book?
We must have. John Lucarotti, he was credited, wasn't he, on screen for The Massacre? Yeah?
I've actually seen a debate over that. There's a question as to whether or not his name appears on screen, but there's no way to find out anymore because the video is long gone.
Yeah. Or whatever. He was listed as the official writer of The Massacre, so you had to approach them first of all. And he said, I don't want to do it because Donald Tosh rewrote it. And we said, well, just do it the way you originally wrote it. And it's a cracking read as well.
He's another one who did really good historical research to bring these books to life. So the Massacre is a very good look at. My favorite part of The Massacre, the book, is when the Doctor is able to figure out what year they're in just by looking at Notre Dame and seeing what's been added or what hasn't been added yet.
Mm-hmm.
Made a big impression on me when I was 12 or 13 discovering that.
Reading The Massacre, I learned about all the catacombs below Paris. I'd never known about them before. So again, Doctor Who being educational and teaching you.
When I was in Paris for the first time in 2018, one of the first things I did was take my family down to the catacombs. We got to walk around and take the tour.
Mm-hmm.
So you could see where, obviously, you're not seeing all the catacombs in the public tour. There's a lot that's inaccessible. But
That's right.
I could imagine William Hartnell and the Protestants hiding out underground, and I could visualize it for myself. I have a very specific question from one of my readers. One of the signal words in Doctor Who novelizations is the word capacious. It appears in about a quarter of the books, especially the Terrence and Malcolm Hulke books. And anyone who uses the word capacious is probably a Doctor Who fan, because so many of us learned that from the targets.
You mean capacious pockets?
Yes, although, according to our research for this podcast, capacious has also been used to describe many other things and not just pockets. Ian Marter only used the word capacious once, and that was in the Reign of Terror. Would that have been a word that you added in, or would that have been his own choice? Because of all the capacious users, he was not the foremost one, but it does appear in a single one of his books.
I imagine it was Ian. I don't think it was me.
Any other memories of working with particular target writers that we might not have had a chance to discuss so far this hour?
No, I mean, Victor Pemberton, total beauty, really, really nice man. We commissioned him to do his story, Fury from the Deep. It was the very first novel he had ever written in his life. And writing that novel and the great reviews it got encouraged him to write other novels. And he turned into a great writer of romantic sagas for girls, for women, for ladies rather. And he was a lovely, lovely person I was proud to call a friend. And also another guy who I really enjoyed working with was Peter Grimwade. Lovely, lovely bloke.
I found his books laugh out loud funny when I was a kid. Peter Grimwade did Time Flight and Mawdryn Undead and Planet of Fire. And he also had tremendous vocabulary. You learn a lot of English reading his books.
Yeah.
With Fury from the Deep, was it always the intention for that to be the longest target ever at 225 pages?
No. Victor exceeded his word count. And I decided that it was so good that we couldn't really cut it. So we released it as a bumper volume at the scandalous price of the time £1.99.
Do you have any input into the cover art? Because Target was doing some terrific cover paintings around your time. Some of the ones that come to mind are the Mythmakers and the Seeds of Death, especially, is one of my personal favorites.
Yeah, a little bit. I tended to source images. Again, the BBC Enterprises weren't particularly forthcoming in helping so much, but I got images from Doctor Who magazine, places like that. And we had an art editor called Mike Brett, who was a great Doctor Who fan as well. So I would just present Mike with some reference images and say, do with them what you want. And he would commission, say, Andrew Skilleter to do those. So that was mostly Mike Brett, the art director, with a bit of input from me.
For Underwater Menace, this is the first of many Doctor Who cover paintings by Alister Pearson, who remains associated with the line.
Yeah, it was Mike Brett who commissioned him the first time. I think Mike Brett was also the person who commissioned Andrew Skilleter for the first time, on Doctor Who anyway.
And Skilleter did the painting, I believe, for your first New Adventure. This would have been for Apocalypse.
Right, yeah.
Time for a couple more questions, I think. The Companions of Doctor Who, which is a short-lived spin-off line in the mid-to-late 1980s. You had the Turlough novel, you had Ian Marter's original novel, Harry Sullivan's War, and then the novelization of K9 and Company. Would that have been your idea?
Partly, yeah. What happened was that Tony Atwood, who'd done, I think, a Blake 7 program guide for Target W.H. Allen, and which I think I edited, he presented us, I think, with a complete manuscript of Turlough and the Earthly Dilemma, which we thought we would publish. And from that, we thought there's a good scope for companion novels. So I commissioned Ian to do Harry Sullivan, obviously. And then the next thing was K9, because that's a TV show. We wanted to do a lot more, but our sales guys weren't particularly keen. They weren't selling the same number of copies as the Doctor Who novelizations were. So they sort of fizzled out, which is a great shame, because I'd spoken to Janet Fielding about a Tegan book. I had spoken to Victor Pemberton possibly about a Victoria book. Ian Martin was definitely going to do a second Harry book. And I might have also thought about approaching Ian to do a Sarah Jane book as well. And I've got a vague memory of probably quite a drunken chat with Nicholas Courtney about possibly doing some kind of Brigadier as well. All these things which never happened.
What is happening now, though, in the 2020s is a lot of the actors and artists are coming back and they are writing novels for their characters. You have a Tom Baker novel based on an idea that he and Ian Marter had. Like I mentioned, Bonnie Langford. Right, Scratchman. Bonnie Langford has a book out. Sophie Aldred has a book out. So in a sense, this idea has carried on into the 21st century, and we are belatedly getting some of these books.
I've not read any of them yet, so I don't know. I can't discuss their merits at all.
And I should ask, were you involved at all with the season 23 missing stories? Because there were 3 of those books later on, too. Or was that after your time?
That was after my time. Joe Thurm did those. A lady called Joe Thurm, I think, commissioned those, who took over from me for about 2 or 3 months.
So, Nigel, I want to thank you very much. You've been more than generous with your time. Thank you very much for sharing your memories with us of the Target books and your Doctor Who fandom over the years.
Great. No problem at all.
Any future endeavors you'd like to share, or any place we can find you online?
Not really, no. I'm all around on Facebook all the time. I'm working on a couple of projects at the moment, so you'll hopefully hear of those in time.
I will spotlight them here when they come out. Nigel, again, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. See you then. Have a good day. Bye.
Doctor Who, The Underwater Menace, by Nigel Robinson, televised as The Underwater Menace, teleplay by Jeffrey Orme, televised in January and February 1967, paperback release date July 21st, 1988, target book number 129, cover artist Alister Pearson. When the TARDIS lands on a deserted volcanic island, the Doctor and his companions find themselves kidnapped by primitive sea people. Taken into the bowels of the earth, they discover they are in the lost kingdom of Atlantis. Offered as sacrifices to the fish goddess, Amdo, the Doctor and his companions are rescued from the jaws of death by the famous scientist Zaroff. But they are still not safe, and nor are the people of Atlantis. For Zaroff has a plan. a plan that will make him the greatest scientist of all time. He will raise Atlantis above the waves, even if it means destroying the world. Name this Doctor Who story. A sincere, devout priest loses his faith after realizing the core of his religion is an empty nothing. And when he attempts to redeem his enemy in episode 3 by gathering together the shattered remnants of his faith, he is killed for his efforts. If you guessed The Curse of Fenric,
no further.
This is holy. It will destroy you.
Objects can't harm us. It's human belief. And you stopped believing when the bombs started falling.
I'm not frightened of German bombs.
Not German bombs. British. On German cities. British bombs killing German children.
No. No!
well, then, congratulations. You're wrong. Come to find out, the Underwater Menace told the exact same story as Fenric 22 years earlier. Granted, Fenric, with its musings on faith, revolves around Reverend Wainwright's tragic journey, and told its story more compactly and effectively. Underwater Menace, on the other hand, floods Raimo's path from believer to unbeliever to brutally murdered corpse in a sea of whimsical acting, costumes, and musical choices. That's the Underwater Menace in a nutshell. The most interesting, mature beats are practically invisible. The bulk of the script is just bonkers. The guest cast is all over the place. Nobody seems quite sure whether this is comedy, horror, or B-movie. The Discontinuity Guide 30 years ago called it Doctor Who's equivalent of Plan 9 from outer space. It takes a special mixture of bad acting and plot illogic to merit such an illustrious comparison. Happy to say, of course, Underwater Menace is much better than Ed Wood's infamous magnum opus. There are ways to enjoy Underwater Menace, and not in a guilty pleasure way either. The story starts off with breathtaking normalcy. The first 10 or 11 minutes are charmingly straightforward, like the Hartnell years. The TARDIS arrives on a volcanic island, and the regulars slowly explore every inch of the location shoot. Because only the 4 regulars are involved, we have time for quiet character moments. The first shot of the episode, according to the telesnaps, is the Doctor's stovepipe hat, which Polly is later seen to wear, adorably. There's a nice montage of the regulars looking hopefully up at the scanner screen, wondering where are they going to land.
Please, let it be Chelsea, 1966.
I hope it's a Daleks. I don't think. Prehistoric monsters.
Earlier in that same scene you just heard, Ben refers to Jamie as me old haggis, a nifty way of reminding the audience that Jamie is Scottish. I don't think. But soon, the travelers are abducted and brought down to the ruins of Atlantis, where the descendants of the survivors of episodes 5 and 6 of the Time Monster, if not the demons, are eking out a hard-scrabble existence and worshipping a giant fish. All of a sudden, we've gone from Hartnell-era methodical examination of the sets, the Doctor studying volcanic rock, Polly sounding out the native language, to lines like, the living goddess Amdo sees and hears all. Jerry Davis, the script editor, who wanted more hard science in his Doctor Who, reportedly tried to kill this story from ever being made, and I suspect his decision came after he read that line in the script. Amdo is an enormous fish head. Her priests wear hats made of rubber tubing, and a frontispiece, which in Raimo's case is a giant shell, and in the case of one the Doctor tries on later, an actual fish head, a roly-poly fish head. The set design is insane, with fish motifs everywhere, and the costume design is on the same overly literal page. Soon we have stock footage of sharks, per the loose cannon recon, grown men wearing fish hats, and a human sacrifice ceremony so over the top that it goes beyond tongue-in-cheek to oh good lord, author Jeffrey Orm was actually being serious. Did you know that Orm intended Professor Zaroff to be a serious character? The original script suggests that Zaroff's dark motivations were the result of his wife and child having been killed in a car accident. Zaroff thus had a reason for killing everyone, an inner motivation, and a sympathetic core, Bless him, actor Joseph First had different ideas for the role, and you know what? We're lucky he did. There's a featurette on the Glengarry Glen Ross DVD release showing acting students trying to recite Alec Baldwin's famous monologue from that film. Always be closing. Always be closing. And that, folks, is an example of why I flunked out of drama camp at 8 years old. Now try this experiment now at home. Go to your nearest mirror. I'll be here when you get back. And try to recite some of Zaroff's lines. Go ahead. Bring them to life as best as you can. Words like blast, 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 or, who could forget, I can feed you to my pet octopus, yes? And the episode 3 cliffhanger. You're going to have a hard time matching First's intensity. Let's give a listen. Although I'm sure this is playing in your head 24 hours a day anyway.
Zaroff, you are subject to me in all matters. I will not have my people.
Your people? Your people? They are my people now. I hold the whole world in my power.
The doctor was right about you. I order your project stopped at this moment. Guards! Take Zaroff to the temple and hold him there.
You're a fool. You're a fool. And I'll send you to your beloved goddess Amno to discuss the future of the universe with her.
I demand.
You demand. You demand. Well, since your beloved goddess has developed such an enchanting appetite for people, it is only fitting that the great South should offer himself.
No. No. I shall offer him.
Kill those 2 men. Nothing in the world can stop me now!
I've said it before on Trap 1 when we discussed the animation with Cy Hart and Fraser Gregory. A script this bonkers, only one way to play it, over the top crazy, and First does exactly that. Wonderfully, when First participated in the Loose Cannon Recon 38 years later, about 3 months before he died, he filmed an in-character epilogue. He just can't say a bad word about the villain when he's willing to come back, a few weeks after The Parting of the Ways aired, to do that. Troughton, who seems to love every second of his time acting opposite Joseph First, also sails right over the edge of subtlety with a twinkle in his eye. There's the bit where he dresses up as a gypsy woman and uses his recorder to blast a cloud of powder into Zaroff's face. I also love this exchange with the somber Ramo, who's given him that aforementioned crazy hat to wear in episode 2.
Where do I look? What? Never mind.
But the Doctor also silently lurks around Zaroff's lab, wreaking havoc in the background. The bit where he and the Doctor exclaim "bang" at each other in reference to Zaroff's destroy the world scheme is a new bit of characterization for the Doctor. Once he understands the enemy's scheme, he does not go all William Hartnell and immediately start blustering righteously, but instead looks for a subtle counterattack. The resolution of the story, however, doesn't make the Doctor appear all that much saner than Zaroff. First, he convinces Sean and Jacko to instigate a strike amongst the food-gathering Atlantean fish people slaves. Don't think too hard about that one. When asked why he's doing this, he has no clear answer, the implication being that it's just a bit of chaos to distract Zaroff and provide more time to formulate a better solution. His ultimate plan is to flood Atlantis. In order to save the city, he destroys it. There is so much mishigas going on here that it's best to just get caught up on the ride and not worry about the resolution, or why the Atlanteans had to turn shipwreck survivors into fish people in order to harvest their food, or why Damon, the chief fish people surgeon, switches sides so quickly in episode 4. Doctor Who is pretty good about showing nominal bad guys who are turned good by the Doctor's moral uprightness, but here there is nothing earned about Damon's sudden change of heart. This would have made more sense plot-wise coming from Ramo, but Ramo was killed off in episode 3, and I've already cried about it. The dialogue is memorably awful, which I'm going to argue is a kind of genius. to be able to write lines that make the audience cheer and cringe at the same time. The worst is reserved for Sean, whose nationality is expressed by lines like, "It isn't closing time at Paddy Murphy's pub," or "It'll take a great gift of the gab to win over the fish people, you know." To which the Doctor responds, "In case you missed the point, but you are Irish." Some of the Doctor's other lines are either genius or awful, or more likely both at the same time. Quote, "Slaves, like worms, can be made to turn," or perhaps the distant roaring that we can hear is just the goddess Amda with the indigestion. The acting styles are inconsistent, with Noel Johnson performing in a highbrow stage play, but forced to share all his scenes with either Troughton or First. The most honest performance comes from Annika Wills. Based upon a particularly harrowing bit in her autobiography, I don't believe she was feigning horror while lying on Damon's operating table. When faced with a script requiring a montage of fish people going on strike in episode 3, director Julia Smith gives us, well, basically something out of 1920s German cinema, with Dudley Simpson's unusual score acting as silent film accompaniment. Looking almost as if they're underwater, the fish people fly through the air, with their Kirby wires only occasionally visible. The sequence goes on for so long, 2 full minutes, that it's both excruciating and exhilarating at the same time. The fact that there was no possible way Julia Smith could have gotten away with mounting the sequence, but does it anyway, is what makes Doctor Who Doctor Who. Even when it's awful, you can't turn your eyes and you can't stop talking about it. I also give props to Ms. Smith for the episode 3 marketplace chase. This is full-on Marx Brothers, with the Doctor playing a gypsy woman and Ben and Jamie in a Benny Hill-style chase with Zaroff's guards. Doctor Who would be a poorer place without the Underwater Menace to talk about. Perhaps all the straight bits, like the first 10 minutes, or the acting choices of Tom Watson and Noel Johnson, could have been brought in line and made properly absurd all the way across the board. But then again, this story was remade, kind of, probably, for the new series as The Vampires of Venice. And you know what? Compared to that, Underwater Menace holds up pretty well. Now the production team had an excuse. This was only Troughton's third story after all, and his character is not quite settled in yet. Half the guest cast, like I said, is on acid. First, Peter Stevens is the High Priest. The other half, Noel Johnson and Tom Watson, being dead serious. The cliffhanger to episode 1, in which Polly is strapped to a gurney and about to be surgically turned into a fish person, is both dead serious and on acid at the same time. Now, how do you turn this into a compelling book? How do you make Zaroff interesting in print without Joseph First there standing on your shoulder to animate his words? Nigel Robinson's idea is to discard the ending and write his own conclusion. Here is what Robinson does. Lolam, the High Priest, escapes the flooding of his temple and takes refuge in Zaroff's laboratory. After Ben and the Doctor escape execution by repeatedly kicking away Zaroff's gun, Lolam, distraught over the loss of his temple, his world, leaps out of hiding and engages in a struggle to the death with Zaroff. This prevents Zaroff from flipping the switch that will end the world and allows the Doctor and Ben to escape the floodwaters. Religion, science, locked in a death struggle, even as the waters rise. A fitting metaphor for the rest of the story. Zaroff, the scientist, controlling the primitive fish goddess worshippers of Atlantis, with Lolam, the High Priest, fighting back with his bare hands. And on TV, bare chest. Not that Peter Stevens, bless him, was exactly bodied by Chippendales. But on TV, we had none of that. That ending never happened. On TV, the Doctor escaped by tricking Zaroff out of his lair, and Ben dropped the bars that separated Zaroff from the death switch. Zaroff then spends like 4 minutes of screen time trying to reach through the bars to flick that switch, and drowns in the process. The greatest scientific mind in the world. In the world! Laid low. By his failure to just, grab a broomstick? So that is why Nigel Robinson rewrote the ending. The rest of the novelization is largely faithful to the TV scripts. As we heard, Nigel did transcribe the whole thing. although Sean's closing time at Paddy Murphy's pub line is thankfully deleted. Now this, in story order, is Jamie's second adventure, so Nigel adds a prologue and an epilogue to bookend the Episode 1 and Episode 4 TARDIS scenes respectively, and these serve as Jamie's major contribution to the story, as we see the TARDIS through his eyes. The Doctor, meanwhile, is at his most clownish, enjoying character traits that would promptly disappear in the very next serial, The Moonbase. Robinson of the book highlights the Doctor's obvious buffoonery, especially in a scene where the Doctor is, quote, upset by his companion's pointed questions. Oh, and Polly is inadvertently topless. In an early scene, Robinson describes her entire outfit, except for her shirt. The chapter titles effectively capture the schizoid nature of the TV serial. Naturally, Chapter 8 is titled Nothing in the World Can Stop Me Now, with exclamation point, which is offset by Chapter 10's dryly ironic title, The Prudence of Zaroff. Now what strikes me is that the Episode 1 cliffhanger, Polly on the operating table, does not get turned into a chapter ender. You know, I should have asked Nigel about that. Now this scene just gets slipped into the middle of a chapter. The milder than warm air Episode 2 cliffhanger does get to end a chapter, even though I was hard-pressed to remember what the TV cliffhanger was a day or so after I watched it last. Zaroff's control center is appropriately dubbed by Robinson the Power Complex. The Doctor, in one of his less competent moments, and in this story that's saying a lot, quote-unquote wisely declines to answer a question because he, quote, wasn't too sure himself, end quote. When Polly is told that the fish people operation will be painless, she observes that she was told the same thing about her polio vaccine. Now, I will say this line does not read so well after COVID brought anti-vax attitudes out into the open. Later on, when the Doctor mentally lists his most fearsome enemies, Nigel, rather cheekily, sneaks the Dravids onto the list. I think Peter Moffat borrowed that idea for the Pandorica Opens. In best Terrence Dicks fashion, there are several moments where Nigel has characters reflect on the story's overall lack of logic. Quote, the Doctor had come up with some strange plans before, but this surely was the strangest of them all. Or when Ben suggests attacking Zaroff with his own pet octopus, Robinson adds, quote, he asked, in all seriousness. For the reasons we explored above, Underwater Menace has some really good elements in it. The whole story may be less than the sum of its parts, but the novelization works hard to point out where the story works, lightly mocks the story where it doesn't work, and then rewrites that ending to show us how the TV story could have worked so much better with just one more draft. Now we have one more Nigel Robinson novelization to go on this podcast. That one deviates even further from the source material. We will talk about that book, but not next week on Doctor Who Literature. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Doctor Who Literature. The executive producer is David Barsky. Each episode is produced by Jim Sangster and yours truly. This week's episode is co-produced by Dale Smith, written and edited by me. Our logo is designed and our YouTube channel is run by Jim Sangster. Very special thanks to my special guest, Nigel Robinson. This podcast can be found on your podcast app of choice, with all past episodes at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/Doctor Who Lit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Blue Sky and YouTube at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, nothing in the world can stop you now!
a Doctor Who podcast network.